Philip Taubman and his brother William have written what the publisher Norton is calling McNamara at War, a new history. The introduction to this full life biography of former Secretary of Defense Robert Strange McNamara says the following, quote, "In McNamara at War, Philip and William Taubman examine McNamara's life of personal contradictions," unquote. It's a portrait of a man at war with himself, according to the authors. It's riven with melancholy, guilt, zealous loyalty, and profound inability to admit his flawed thinking about Vietnam before it was too late. And that's according to the authors. William Taubman, 7 years older than his brother at 83, is an emeritus political science professor from Amherst College. Brother Phil spent 30 years with the New York Times and is an author of several books. Which one of the Taubmans can tell the story about what happened to Robert McNamara when he was on the ferry boat to Martha's Vineyard?
Wow.
And that is in your book.
Well, that was a story. This happened after he had, quite a bit after, I think, he had been Secretary of Defense, and he was on his way to Martha's Vineyard, where he had a house, a beautiful house, and a guy who had fought in Vietnam watched McNamara seemingly enjoying himself at the bar, and he came in and said, "Mr. McNamara, there's a phone call for you." And McNamara turned and followed him out on the deck. They headed for the bridge, but before they got there, this guy suddenly grabbed McNamara and tried to throw him off over the edge of the ferry boat into the water. And he succeeded in getting McNamara over the rail, sort of hanging by his nails, his hands, and yelling for help. And this angry former soldier who had obviously lost some of his buddies in the war tried to get McNamara to fall over, in which case he would have either drowned or been chopped up by the screw. But fortunately, people came and saved McNamara. And when they got to Martha's Vineyard, they proposed to charge the man who had tried to throw McNamara overboard with assault and attempted murder. But McNamara said, "Don't do it. Let's forget about it." And
Phil Taubman, what is that story? What kind of a meaning is there to that story in your book?
Well, the meaning to that story to me is that McNamara's behavior caused this kind of rage in the mind of the men whom he had sent to battle, but that in McNamara's mind there was also a sense that he himself was guilty, and therefore he wasn't going to press charges against a guy whose anguish and anger and rage he understood all too well.
I must say to our audience, it's going to be a little hard to figure out who's Bill and who's Phil, and I'll try to fill in the blanks when I can. But Phil Taubman, what part of this book did you spend most of your time on?
I think I focused mostly on the Defense Department years. The way we divvied up the labor is that Bill focused on the early years up through Ford Motor Company. And then I focused on the years as Defense Secretary, which ran from 61 at the beginning of the Kennedy administration until early 68 when McNamara became president of the World Bank. And then Bill, again, focused on the years after the Pentagon.
In your opinion, Phil Taubman, when did the lying begin?
Well, the lying began much earlier in a kind of interesting interior way. The line I think you're referring to is the line about Vietnam and the progress that was being made on the battlefield, which wasn't really being made, and that McNamara bought into, to try to sell the war to the American public. But the line, you can look back earlier in his life and see that he was kind of lying to himself about his stress level. It turns out McNamara was a man beset by intense stress that developed, I think, early on, partly because of pressure from his mother to succeed. And by the time he got to be an executive at Ford Motor Company after World War II, he lived day in and day out with enormous stress that only he and his wife and maybe his children understood. And so I think the lying in a kind of chronic way, lying to oneself about what's going on, putting on a happy face publicly, a strong face publicly, while being racked by insecurity inside. I think it began long before his involvement in Vietnam.
Bill Taubman, how many years did you spend looking at Robert McNamara, and what did you take away after you'd done this book?
Well, I started working on it in something like 2018, 19, and here we are in 2025. The thing that stunned me and continues to shock me is the kind of double life that McNamara led. On the one hand, he appeared to the world to be, and he was, brilliant, decisive, dominant figure in both the Kennedy and Johnson cabinets, leading the fight in Vietnam, advocating for its escalation and all of that. But the other life he led was as an opponent, a kind of secret opponent of the war, who concluded as early as 1965 that the war was militarily unwinnable. And from that point on, what he wanted to do, he admitted later, was to tell Johnson, President Johnson, that we should get out of Vietnam. But he couldn't bring himself to do that. That's another question. He couldn't bring himself to do that. And so he stayed on, continuing to manage the war and increasingly tormented with the war and with his own inability to do what he felt he should do, but he didn't dare do.
Phil Taubman, when did the military begin to dislike him?
Well, really, from the day one at the Pentagon, he came in with a very broad mandate from John Kennedy, which was to get civilian control of the military. It sounds odd. The Defense Department was created in the late 1940s under civilian control with a defense secretary. But in reality, through the late 40s and through the Eisenhower administration, it was basically run by the service chiefs, Air Force, Navy, Army, Marine Corps, etc. They came up with their own budgets. They didn't compare budgets. They didn't compare weapons systems. It was really operated by the military brass. And McNamara came in like a bull in a china shop and said, hell no, we're going to organize this place in a sensible way. There's going to be centralized budgeting. We're going to have weapon systems that are ordered up that can be used across services, not just for one service. And so from day one as defense secretary, he essentially demanded a revolution at the Defense Department in the way it was organized and operated. And the service chiefs, the top brass, resisted it. They hated it. And as a consequence, they came to be very antagonistic to McNamara, who would not brook fools lightly. And he would go to meetings and demand answers and send generals and admirals back to their offices with their tails between their legs, really. It was quite shocking to the military leadership.
I don't know what others' reaction will be to this book, but I have to say mine was, after I read it, is your head is spinning, because you talk about the double life, and we can go on beyond that with the double life he had with women in his life. But before we do that, I want to read this quote from LBJ, Bill Taubman. When McNamara leaves, why he becomes a hero. He was it used the expression GD screwball as long as he's in there. Here's LBJ calling him a screwball after we read LBJ praising him all through the war. What was he, a screwball or a hero?
I don't think he was either. Um, I don't think he was a hero who sent so many innocent soldiers to die and was responsible for the death of hundreds of thousands or millions of Vietnamese in a cause that in which he didn't believe. That's not heroism. On the other hand, he was not a screwball. He was a man who was deeply divided in his own mind and in his own life, and trying to make the best of that kind of schizophrenia, not medical schizophrenia, but sort of political, military schizophrenia, if you can put it that way. Um, and for Johnson to call him that was a hell of a shift, because Johnson had virtually worshipped McNamara earlier. Johnson himself was deeply divided in his mind. He turns out to have been uh, manic depressive, and he spent a significant amount of time in bed at key moments of his life, covered up by his pillows, until his wife came in and begged him to get out and get up and resume his work life. So Johnson was really a mess, and he latched on to McNamara as somebody who seemed super organized and super decisive and super confident, all the qualities that Johnson during these periods of depression lacked.
In the back of the book, we can read who you interviewed and when you interviewed them, but you also in the book are generous to the people you quote by name in the book. And I want to ask you about them and what impact they had on you. Phil Taubman, how about Deborah Shapley's book from 1993, Promise and Power? Why did you use that?
Well, we made use of the vast number of materials available about Robert McNamara. We added to it new materials, which we can talk about. But the existing kind of literature about McNamara was extensive. Deborah Shapley wrote quite a good biography about him that was published in the mid 1990s. David Halberstam included a thick section of the best and the brightest about McNamara. So, the literature was out there and we benefited from it. And the authors of those books who were still alive helped us, gave us access to their archives. And so the least we could do was to credit them as we went along.
You have several, maybe 2 or 3 pages of a list of interviews unpublished from a lot of people. Why are all those interviews, and people supplied them to you, were they unpublished, Bill Taubman?
Phil, I'm going to ask you. I can open the book. I don't remember which ones you have in mind there.
So
they're about 2.5 pages of them.
Yeah, no, a lot of them came from the work that I'm blanking momentarily on his name at the Washington.
Paul Hendrickson.
Oh, sorry, Paul Hendrickson. Paul wrote a wonderful book about McNamara, also published in the mid 90s. And it was a polemical book, but also a deeply researched book and a beautifully written book. And Paul's method of operation in researching that book was to sit down with dozens of people who had known McNamara over the years, to interview them and to take notes, extensive notes on the interviews. And Paul very graciously and generously gave us access to those notes. So that a lot of the unpublished interviews that you allude to, Brian, are in Paul Hendrickson's archives, which he very generously allowed us to use.
But you've also got unpublished interviews by Henry Brandon. Here's one, Arthur Schlesinger, unpublished interview by William Manchester, 1964, found in William Manchester's papers at Wesleyan University.
Yeah. So, the key to researching history is never to give up, to be as ingenious as you can in looking for sources. So the William Manchester papers reside at Wesleyan University, as you said. I don't know that many people have gone back to look at them since he wrote the book about the death of the president, the assassination of Kennedy. but in them are his transcripts, in his cases, of recorded interviews that he did. And you find all kinds of fascinating material in there. In the case you allude to, it's an interview he did with Arthur Schlesinger. The Henry Brandon interview turns up in, of all places, the Library of Congress, where he donated some of his papers. And if you get his archives and dig through them, you find a diary that he kept. He was very meticulous about recording on paper right after his conversations with various people. And we found it's very interesting. It's one of the few comments that is known during the Vietnam years when McNamara was defense secretary, where he is openly critical of Lyndon Johnson.
I see in the back in the back that William Taubman, Bill Taubman, back in 2019, on 2 or 3 occasions, interviewed Diana McNamara. Can you tell us what you most remember from those interviews?
Diana McNamara, this is McNamara's second wife, whom he married in 2004, and he would die only 5 years later, is an Italian woman by birth, an Italian socialite who married before McNamara another American who had a lot of money. And she lives in Middleburg, Virginia, in a beautiful house, which turns out to be next to a former plantation, which the Kennedys rented so that Jacqueline Kennedy could ride horses. And she turned out, as I think Phil may have mentioned earlier, she turned out to have in her basement a magnificent archive consisting of papers of McNamara that he bequeathed to her in his will. This contained everything from letters from McNamara's mother to him, beginning when he was at Harvard Business School in the 30s, letters from Jacqueline Kennedy to McNamara, documents of all kinds. She gave us access to all of this. She was very generous and very helpful, and she had some pretty strong opinions, especially about Washington and the way in which she felt that it had corrupted her husband, corrupted him in the sense that it got him used to a kind of easier way of life, a kind of game playing, even womanizing, that she rejected, not only because her husband had done it, but because she just didn't believe that it was proper. So she was a crucial source to us in many ways over the years.
Phil Taubman, I don't know if you got into this at all, but I can remember many years ago, I was at Dulles Airport about to get on an airplane, and I looked up, and there standing in front of me was Bob McNamara and Joan Braden. And I bring that up because during those times, there were lots of gossipy things about Joan Braden and Bob McNamara while his wife was still alive and she was quite ill with cancer. And I thought to myself, there they are. They're on their way somewhere together. So can you fill in the blanks on what that story meant to this book? Because in the back of this book, the last part, you do a lot of this kind of conversation about the women in his life.
Well, indeed, he had a very close relationship with Joan Braden, who at the time was married to Tom Braden. They had what was known.
8 children. They had 8 children, Phil. Yeah.
They had what was known then and would be today as an open marriage, meaning that either spouse felt free to, spend time with other people. And she took a liking to McNamara. He took a liking to her. And they spent a lot of time together, both in Washington and traveling. Your encounter with them at Dulles Airport was probably at the beginning of one of many foreign trips that they took together. Paul Hendrickson, whom we mentioned earlier, at the time a Washington Post reporter, learned about the relationship and did a really remarkable story about the McNamara-Braden relationship that appeared in the Post. I think it was that story that actually led Paul to go on to write the book that he did. What we discovered in pursuing this issue a bit was that Joan Braden had always said that the relationship with McNamara was not physical, at least until Margie McNamara, Bob McNamara's wife, had died. That does not seem to have been the case. Sally Quinn, a name I'm sure you know, Brian, a former Washington Post reporter, the wife of the late Ben Bradley, the great Washington Post editor, told me about a dinner party at the home of a well-known Washington socialite that she went to while Margie McNamara was still alive, suffering gravely from cancer, so in pain so much that she had to rest on the dining room table because she wasn't comfortable in bed. And while she was in that state, Bob McNamara and Joan Braden, Sally said, were dancing intimately on the floor of the, during this dinner party in a way that Sally said just shocked her.
Please excuse us for interrupting. We'll continue our conversation in a minute. William Taubman, what did you think of the book in retrospect?
What did I think of which book, Brian?
The book that Bob McNamara himself wrote in 1995.
Yes. Well, it's a startling book in its openness about his own feelings of guilt. It's a book in which he says, and this has often been quoted, we were wrong, terribly wrong about Vietnam. I can't think of another memoir by a high official of this or any other government that is as frank about his errors and mistakes and even crimes. I mean, he goes so far as to remember Curtis LeMay, the general who was in charge of the firebombing of Tokyo, which McNamara had helped to organize. And what May said was, if we had lost the war, we would have been judged war criminals. And that was the case. But on the other hand, for people like us trying to write McNamara's biography, it was in a way disappointing because most of the book is devoted to Vietnam, and only a very short chapter is devoted to McNamara's life before 1961. And yet we wanted to talk about his whole life. We wanted to explore the roots of his behavior later on in the 60s, in his youth, in his childhood, in his years at Berkeley as a student, at Harvard Business School, in the military. And McNamara didn't give us much to work with on that.
Philip Taubman, what did you think of the book?
I agree with Bill. It was a cri de coeur in some ways, a man who obviously felt tormented by what he had done in managing the Vietnam War. But, it's also full of excuses for the things that they did. In the end, he condemns himself and the Johnson administration for making the decisions that they made, but he tries to explain them. And in the end, and this is what really angered, I think, a lot of people when the book came out, he never apologized for what he did. As Bill said, he acknowledged it was wrong, but he never really apologized for the bloodshed that he was responsible for.
Peter Osnos pushed Robert McNamara to write that book in the first place, and we've talked to him here on several occasions. Did you follow the kind of material that he was able to provide for this story?
Yes,
yeah,
we did.
I think Peter was extremely helpful. Peter and his colleague or collaborator on the McNamara book with Bob McNamara, Brian Vandemark, who's a professor at the Naval Academy. Both Peter and Brian made all their interview transcripts with McNamara available to Bill and me.
May I add, Brian, that Brian Vandermark gave us really a crucial set of papers. Vandermark, beginning in the 80s, had set out to write a biography of McNamara, but in the course of his long interviews with McNamara convinced him to shift course, and instead of writing a biography, he would help McNamara write his own autobiography, namely the book we've just been talking about in retrospect. And in that role, Brian Vandermark interviewed people beginning with high school classmates of McNamara and people from throughout McNamara's life. And he had more than 1,000 pages of transcripts of these interviews. And he was generous enough to give us access to them. So it was as if we had done these interviews ourselves, and we could use them. And without them, the book wouldn't have been nearly as detailed, I hope, and as convincing.
Well, here's one of them, Annalee Whitmore from high school girlfriend. You quote her as saying, he was thoughtful, he was fun to be with, he was always considerate, he was just an extraordinary man. And that's kind of why I said earlier how your head spins when you read this, because then you have some of the things that he used to say to people in the midst of their arguments over the whole war and everything. Which man was he?
He was both. That first man, that charming, joyful, funny, vivid young man, I think was equally emotional and passionate and determined to fight the war and win the war, at least until he decided it was unwinnable. And I think what he did in his life as he got higher and higher, first of all in the military, then at the Ford Motor Company, then at the Defense Department, what he did was he muffled his own emotions, or he tried to. He tried not to reveal how moved he was by what he had done and what he had not done, and how tormented he was, because all of this would be a sign of weakness. But his emotions flooded out at times. He couldn't prevent himself from weeping. We found there were many occasions in public when he was meeting with friends or meeting with officials, when he would suddenly start weeping, overcome by the emotion he felt. And can you imagine how these friends felt when this Iron Man, this computer with legs, as Senator Barry Goldwater called him, suddenly turned into a fount of tears? That's what he was. He was both of those things.
Philip Taubman, you spent years with the New York Times and how many years here in Washington?
Well, altogether, close to 20.
When you read this book and you go through the fact that he was so close to Katharine Graham, he was so close to Ben Bradlee, the Joe Alsop dinners in Georgetown on Sunday night, all those things, and how at one point I think you quote somebody as saying, Katharine Graham's son saying that Bob McNamara wanted to marry Kay Graham. What's that feel like to you as a journalist that covered the war back in those days?
Well, it's very familiar for any journalist who worked in Washington over the decades. It really was only in recent years that the divisions in Washington have become so severe that Republicans and Democrats no longer get together socially. But back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, part of that time I was working as a reporter and editor in Washington, there would be these end of the day gatherings, many of them in Georgetown, quite a few of them hosted by Katharine Graham and others, at which people on opposite sides of the political spectrum would get together over dinner and drinks, and they would have a civil conversation and civil disagreements. That's basically over today. So I think that it's interesting to note that Bob McNamara came to Washington determined not to be part of that world. When he was president of Ford Motor Company or climbing the ranks at Ford, he quite deliberately lived in Ann Arbor, away from Grosse Pointe and the places where the executives at Ford and GM and other companies lived. He did that because he did not want to be part of the social scene. He came to Washington determined to do the same, told JFK that that was his plan. And then literally within days of getting to Washington, he starts showing up at Georgetown parties. The first, even before John Kennedy's inauguration, was hosted by one of Kennedy's sisters. And he very quickly got drawn into that whole world. And it's another, I think, example of the paradoxes of Robert McNamara. He would go to these dinner parties. He would talk privately with Katharine Graham, Bobby Kennedy, Jackie Kennedy about how the war was going. I think honestly depicting the struggle of the United States to get traction in Vietnam. And yet he would go out in public and talk about how much progress was being made.
There's a lot of in this book about Jackie Kennedy, and here's just one quote where he's writing a note to her. I think this is near the end of their relationship. As I was leaving you, I fear I revealed unintentionally how much I miss you, and how deep my love for you remains. Perhaps it was because your smile was never more beautiful. That's just one of many quotes you have. Can either one of you go back and trace the relationship between Robert McNamara and Jackie Kennedy from the very beginning to the end?
Well, it began almost immediately after McNamara joined the administration. You find in press coverage in Washington stories in 1961, the year Kennedy was inaugurated, stories about parties at the White House in which McNamara was dancing, doing the twist, a very popular dance at the time. Chubby Checker was the rocker who made it famous, and people loved to do the twist. And there's stories in the Washington Post about Jackie Kennedy and Robert McNamara. What an unlikely couple when you think about it, dancing the twist at the White House. And after those stories appeared, she sent him a playful note. It was a kind of put together by Jackie Kennedy that talked about their dancing the twist at the White House. And she wondered aloud if they would have to claim executive privilege if it ever became known to Strom Thurmond, for example, who was a very conservative Republican senator from South Carolina. And from then on, the relationship seemed to deepen. What we have evidence of is based on the letters that Jackie Kennedy wrote to Bob McNamara, beginning in 61 and running on well past the end of the Johnson administration. We only have that one fragment of a letter that McNamara wrote to her, which you just cited. We believe that the letters he wrote to her were probably destroyed by him, but the relationship developed during the Cuban Missile Crisis. For example, Jackie wrote a very extensive note to Robert McNamara talking about how she had watched the developments unfold during the tense days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and she thought that he was a hero in his role during the crisis, at least at the beginning, was to urge restraint rather than an invasion of Cuba. And then as time went on, the letters seemed to grow more affectionate. The day of the assassination, a horrible day we all remember, I think drew them together in a profound way. When JFK's body was returned to Washington on Air Force One, he was out at Andrews Air Force Base. Bobby Kennedy had called him and asked him to come out to be there when Jackie and now President Johnson and JFK's body were returned. And that night, he spent the entire night at the Naval Hospital in Bethesda, seated next to Jackie. He was seated on the floor. She was seated on a kind of bar stool in the suite upstairs where the family had gathered. And that night, just think about this. She's still wearing that pink suit that's splattered with the brain matter and blood of her husband. She's seated there that night, and she keeps recalling over and over again the ghastly scene in Dallas. And Bob McNamara is seated next to her. And at one point in the evening, he says to her, "Well, you're going to be without a home soon. I would be prepared to buy you a house in Georgetown if you would like." So you can see that must have meant an enormous amount to Jackie. And then from then on out through the Vietnam years under LBJ, she saw him as an opponent of the war. And they would get together repeatedly at her apartment in New York. They would go out to dinner, and she would say, "Bob, you've got to end the killing." And in a passage in the book in which he describes one of these encounters at her Fifth Avenue apartment, she is pounding him on the chest with her fists to end the war. And he says later to Peter Osnos, talking about this, he says, basically, I wanted to end the war too, but I didn't know how to do it.
William Taubman, your reaction to this story?
Well, it was a shock to learn how close they were. And some people have actually asked us, can you be specific? How close did they really get in the end? And our answer was that we do not know. But it was clearly a relationship of deep affection, of deep meaning to him. And it sort of shows again that in a world in which other people are behaving badly, including JFK himself with his history of womanizing, McNamara seemed to be a beacon of integrity to Mrs. Kennedy, as well as to many other people he saw and knew in life.
There is a story, though, in the book about when Jacqueline Kennedy and Robert McNamara were together, and Robert McNamara's wife, Margie, was sick, didn't know where he was, and trying to find him, and she couldn't find him. Is that your story, Phil?
Yeah, so this, again, is supported by letters she wrote to him and other material. So it was at the point that John Kennedy went to Berlin and gave the famous speech in Berlin, Ich ein Berliner, I'm a Berliner, solidarity with the West Berliners. A huge crowd had gathered by the Brandenburg Gate as he delivered the speech. And, this was the era before instantaneous television coverage of everything. And so later that day, McNamara went to the White House to watch a recording of the speech that had been transmitted somehow back to Washington, and watched it with Jackie in the private quarters of the White House upstairs. They commented she was proud of the job that her husband had done. And they then went out to dinner at a very Tony Washington Georgetown restaurant. And while they're there, Margie McNamara is out in Detroit visiting a friend of theirs who was a senior executive at Ford Motor Company. And the senior executive recounted his memory of that evening. And what he recalled was that Margie McNamara tried to reach her husband. This, of course, is long before the cell phone era. So she's undoubtedly calling the Pentagon Operations Center on a landline and saying, "I want to speak to my husband." And the Defense Department, in theory, should have been able to reach Robert McNamara very quickly by calling his security detail, which would have some kind of radio link to the Pentagon. Well, he may not even have had a security detail. That's the way he operated. So he's sitting there at the restaurant. Margie's trying to reach him unsuccessfully when she finally reaches him later that evening, presumably by then he's back home in Washington, she is very exasperated, and she makes clear to the Ford executive that she is surprised and unhappy, essentially, to discover that her husband is out to dinner with Jackie Kennedy.
Bill Taubman, you did a book on Khrushchev, a book on Gorbachev. I don't know that there's any comparison here, but if you read about during the Vietnam War, there continued to be partying here in Washington, partying at the White House while people were dying in Vietnam. Is there anything wrong with that?
Is there anything wrong with partying while people are dying?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like an obvious answer, but anyway, this town kept continuing to be very social while a lot of people were dying and being wounded in Vietnam.
Yes. Well, I guess if I had been involved in that, I would have felt guilty about that. And I think McNamara probably did at some level. I think it was another way in which he repressed some of his painful thoughts and went about life as it was being lived in Washington. But it was all the more, I think, difficult for him to cope with this because he had set out to avoid it. As Phil says, when he agreed to become defense secretary, he told Kennedy he wanted to be a working defense secretary, not a socializing defense secretary. But he was unable to resist that kind of social life in Washington. And therefore, I imagine he was ambivalent about it. In the famous, wonderful documentary film called The Fog of War that Errol Morris made with McNamara, I was struck by how there are various scenes in it. And of course, McNamara is commenting on those historical scenes which are captured on film. And he goes back and forth. At one point, he's practically in tears over what happened in the war and his own wartime record in World War II. And then suddenly he says, but it was the greatest time in our lives, as if there it is. He can barely hold back the tears of guilt, and yet he can't resist saying it was a great time. I mean, swimming in Bobby Kennedy's pool, going to the seminars that Bobby Kennedy set up at Hickory Hill, his estate, engaging in what is described as the scintillating intellectual back and forth at these seminars. So he was simultaneously deeply tormented and having a ball. And that sounds impossible, but he was capable of both at the same time.
What year did Margie die?
1981, I believe.
What year did Robert McNamara die?
2009.
Either one of you talked to his three children?
I talked extensively to Craig, his son, who probably had the most difficult relationship of the children with their father. And Craig wrote his own wrenching memoir about it that came out a few years ago. Craig, to this day, is reckoning with the conduct of his father and the relationship that they had. The sisters, Bill talked to Margie, and Kathleen, the third sibling, we communicated with, with some email exchanges after we sent her a copy of the manuscript that we had drafted. We sent it to all three kids to look at, to comment back to us while we still had a chance to fix any mistakes or account for things that we had not accounted for. But I would say by far the most extensive conversations were mine with Craig.
What did you learn from him that you didn't know before you started all this?
Well, I didn't know before I started just how estranged he had become from his father. He and I both were students and undergraduates at Stanford University at the same time. Didn't know each other then. But I didn't realize that when he had come out to Stanford, he had quickly gotten involved in anti-war demonstrations, violent anti-war demonstrations periodically. I did not know that he had fled Stanford because he basically couldn't deal with the fact that he was the son of Robert McNamara. And he had spent time on a motorcycle going down through Central America, eventually made his way all the way down to Chile, and then spent months on Easter Island, one of the most remote, isolated places on the planet, because he was struggling to come to grips with who he was, who his father was, and what their relationship was. And, over time, there was a reconciliation. They clearly both loved each other, even through these difficult days. But the story of Craig's reckoning with being a member of the McNamara family is quite heartbreaking.
There were a couple of incidents I remember that Craig told us about or wrote about, which reflected not only on his relationship with his father, but his father's relationship with that is Robert McNamara's parents. One of them was, I think what Craig said is, if my father had trouble being a father to me, that's because his father was not much of a father to him, which is quite true. His father was aloof and distant, and probably that influenced McNamara's own distance from his children. The other incident was Craig was talking about growing up in Ann Arbor in the 1950s, and his grandmother, Robert McNamara's mother, was visiting them, and Craig uttered a few curse words, and so his grandmother took him upstairs to the bathroom and insisted that he wash his mouth with soap, which is an example of her sort of propriety, her notion of propriety, her prudishness, her disciplining of both her son and now her grandson in her effort to make sure that they were exemplary young men, which also had an effect in driving McNamara to try to excel, which is, of course, what he did. And McNamara's life can be summed up in this sense. He was a brilliant success at everything he tried, at every meeting, every challenge he met. He coped with everything he met until the Vietnam War threw him for a loss. He managed every challenge except the Vietnam War, which posed a challenge he could not meet in the end.
Please excuse us for interrupting. We'll continue our conversation in a minute.
Before we finish this, I have to ask you about something that I found unusual in the praise for McNamara at war. This is on the back of your book. I have a galley proof. I don't have the hard copy. And I read this endorsement from a man named Joe Ellis. The Taubman brothers have given us the deepest probe into the formative years of Robert McNamara, seeking an answer to the following question: how could such a brilliant man lead the United States into an unnecessary and unwinnable war in Vietnam and then become the designated face of that failure? I suspect you know why I'm asking you this. Joe Ellis was suspended from Mount Holyoke when he lied to his students over a 15-year period that he had fought in Vietnam and that he had been on the staff of Westmoreland, and he hadn't done any of that. And I just want to ask you, why would you include that as an endorsement of this book?
Well, I happen to know Joe Ellis because he taught for many years at Mount Holyoke College down the road from Amherst College, where I teach. And I've read his books. And in his dealings with me, I never sensed that I was encountering that kind of behavior. And I've never seen any criticism of his books, which is to say he did not lie in writing these quite marvelous books about American founders. So I had that in mind too. He's a marvelous writer and quite a historian. even though he misbehaved in that way in his classes. And that's why I wanted to include his endorsement of a book, he having written so many marvelous ones himself.
One of the questions I start out with is, when did the lying start? And that's why I wanted to ask you about this, is when do you forgive somebody? If I had been in his classroom for 15 years and he had told me the story about how he had fought in Vietnam, he did teach at the military academy.
Yes, he did.
But he also told his students that he had been on marches in the 60s down to Mississippi, and that wasn't true either. At what point do you say, I'm going to trust this guy with history?
Well, at the point when I decided I was going to trust him with history, that is, I've kept my eye out. I've been looking for moments when people might charge him with having deceived us in writing these books. I've never seen that alleged. So I trusted him to praise our book, which of course was a nice thing to hear. And I like him as a person, but I realize that is part of his past. And I know that he lost some of his close friends as friends and colleagues when that happened at Mount Holyoke.
I must say, I like the man too. I haven't seen him in years, but he was very kind to me. And we talked about John Adams in the early days, and he took me up to the Boston Public Library and showed me the big John Adams collection of books and all the marginalia. So I just want to make sure that, I mean, he is a nice man. This was so odd.
Yeah.
It hasn't been talked about for a long time. Anyway, going back to the book, Phil, what part of you said you learned stuff, new stuff that you didn't know before. What would be the most significant thing that you learned in all of your research that went into this book?
I think to me, it was the reality of the double life that McNamara led, the depth of it, the origins of it. I was not an anti-war activist at college because I was working on the college paper at Stanford, and I tried to observe the journalistic ethic of not taking sides on issues that I was writing about. But my perception of McNamara from that era was of a warmonger, someone who had sent tens and thousands of American young men, mostly some women, but mostly men, to the killing fields of Vietnam. And I didn't understand then, nor did I really understand at the time that his book came out, the depth of the double life that he led and the toll that it took on him. I'm not particularly sympathetic to the toll it took, but he did spend the last decades of his life in a form of torment over what he had done. So to me, I think that was the big takeaway. And the other thing that struck me was the nature of the relationship with Jackie Kennedy. I had no idea that McNamara, of all people, this kind of mechanical brainiac figure of the Johnson and Kennedy years, would have had a very affectionate, close relationship with Jackie Kennedy.
The thing that struck me, Brian, I'm not a Washington person. I've always been in an academic setting, but I've, of course, observed with a lot of us fellow citizens these powerful mammoth figures, presidents and their advisors. And we don't really know what's going on in their heads. Even biographies have trouble reaching that kind of interiority. But what struck me was here suddenly we had the full panoply of internal contradictions in this man, the kinds of things that might be there in others, but we can't be sure. We don't know. And so I found myself thinking, my God, how many people in Washington with that kind of fame and that kind of power and that kind of influence are actually leading interior lives like this? Is it full of people like this, or is this an exception? And I've tried to go out of my way to ask people I know, the few people I know who are from Washington, and I, they don't know either. So to me, it was a rare and valuable glimpse of the interior life that we don't usually penetrate or see, of all these powerful people who flash before us on our TV screens and social media and all the rest.
Philip Taubman, did you talk to anybody in the military or who's retired from the military that still thinks McNamara did the right thing in Vietnam?
Not in a research mode for the book, but I do know people like that. There's still, I think, a school of thought that, if blames McNamara, not so much for losing the war, but for failing to agree to the kinds of steps that would have won the war, which would have been even greater American involvement. That potentially, at least the threat of the use of nuclear weapons. I think another thing I learned from doing the research is that McNamara and Johnson essentially took a moderate course in Vietnam as they escalated. I thought of it at the time as this massive escalation, which it was in terms of the manpower on the ground, boots on the ground. But there were people at the Pentagon in the military who were urging them to take the battle not only to Hanoi, but up further into Vietnam, right to the Chinese border. And both McNamara and Johnson feared that kind of escalation would potentially ignite a confrontation with the Soviet Union or China that could rapidly escalate into a nuclear exchange. But there certainly are people, and I wouldn't be surprised if there aren't some in the Trump administration, who feel that the failure of Vietnam was that we didn't unleash the full American arsenal there.
William Taubman, you taught at Amherst for how many years?
For how many years? I began teaching in the fall of 1967, and I retired in 2016.
As you watch students come through Amherst, what was the impact of the Vietnam War over the years?
Well, in the early years there, the late 60s and early 70s, when the Vietnam War was still on, the students were not all of them, but quite a number of them were very radical. They were anti-war. They extended that to a condemnation of American foreign policy since World War II. They were revisionists on the Cold War. They imagined that the United States was responsible for it rather than Joseph Stalin. That was the period of particular radicalism by students. As the years went by, that eased and changed, and students focused more on their studies per se and their careers and getting ready. And I don't think the students have ever gone back to that kind of fierceness that they had in those days. And I must say, as a teacher, it was very stimulating to have students who talk back to you from a position to the left of you, as it were. And I remember as a Soviet specialist that I was constantly reminding them of what had gone on in the Soviet Union that had led not only to the Cold War, but to the tyranny of Stalin and Stalinism. They kind of pushed me in a more conservative direction, as it were. And that helped me, the sort of crossfire of what they were telling me and what I was trying to tell them back helped me to define myself and my own views and my own philosophy. So I was grateful for them, even though at times they were a particularly unpleasant challenge.
Phil Taubman, what do you think the impact of the Vietnam War has been on the United States?
I think it's profound. When you go back, and the other books that I've done deal with Cold War incidents, including the U-2 flight that was shot down over the Soviet Union in 1960. I think what you see is the breakdown of trust in the government. To me, one of the first breaks was the U-2 flight, where American spy plane was sent across the entire Soviet Union to gather photographic intelligence. It was shot down, and the Eisenhower administration planned to go public if it were shot down at some point. There had been many prior flights. Was to claim, as they did, that it was a weather flight gathering weather data, and that the plane, if it had strayed into Soviet territory, had done so mistakenly. It was in Turkish airspace. Eisenhower himself made that public statements, and I thought that was a break point. Then the next big break point was the Vietnam War, where it was clear that Robert McNamara in particular was lying repeatedly over and over again about the state of the war. The next big break point was Watergate and Nixon. And I think when you look at that sequence of events, it helps explain how we got to a point in this country where trust in institutions, many of our institutions, not just the government, has essentially been shattered.
Need to wrap things up, but I want to ask the two of you just a little bit about the process of doing this book. How did you do it, Bill Taubman?
Well, the pandemic actually was central to the doing of this book. In 2019, 20, 21, I suddenly found that I wasn't traveling because of the pandemic. I wasn't socializing. I wasn't teaching because I had retired. What was I going to do with myself? I ended up devoting all my time to this book, which I wouldn't have had available otherwise. At that point, Phil was busy finishing his book on George Shultz, his biography of Secretary of State George Shultz. So in the beginning, I was sort of operating on my own until he was free to join in. And it was a wonderful project for me to have at that point. And when Phil came in, it was even more wonderful because suddenly there were two of us. And Phil, as a journalist, had gotten used to using a full-time research assistant, whereas I, as a professor, had done most of that footnote and bibliography work myself. So suddenly we had a full-time assistant, and Phil was working full-time himself. So it felt as if we had a kind of phalanx as we proceeded with this book. And then we began exchanging pages that we'd written and editing each other and discovering, as Phil put it in one of our conversations, that our own writing styles were rather similar. And if there was any question of our arguing, as Phil also put it, that was muffled by the fact that I'm 6 years older than Phil. So I had seniority, but it has brought us together. I mean, we've gotten along fine our whole lives, but this was the first time we had worked together that closely on a project. And as we wrote in our dedication in the book, we dedicated it to our parents, who we said would have loved the idea that the two of us were writing a book together.
I understand, right? You both were born in New York City.
Yes.
And Bill Taubman, you live in Amherst. And Phil Taubman, where do you live today?
I've split my time between the Bay Area, where I remain affiliated at Stanford, and family property outside New York.
So what about the process of writing this book with your brother? What's the most memorable part of it?
Well, thank God for Google Drive. So, we've got all kinds of material that's recorded electronically that we both have access to. And then, as we were drafting, we were working with Google Documents so we could easily see what the other person was doing. The writing of it and editing of it, as Bill said, we We edited each other. It was really quite seamless. In the pre-digital era, it would have been much more cumbersome. But these days, you can work on a chapter literally simultaneously.
I love the idea that almost every document that we came up with, we had online eventually. So if there was a speech at a particular date, we just click on it and up it would come. And that is, I'm old enough so that still seems like a miracle to me. And it certainly made it much easier to write this book.
Philip Taubman and his brother William Taubman. The book is called McNamara at War, A New History. Thank you both for spending time with us.
Thank you.
Our pleasure.
Thanks for tuning into this week's Booknotes Plus podcast. If you have a moment, please consider rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. Your feedback will help others discover the program. And don't forget to share this episode with friends and family. For the latest on new episodes, schedule updates, and more, follow us on X @C-SPAN Radio.